Today we're going to continue our discussion of implied pulse, something we started in the last series. So even if you're out on the dance floor and you're confronted with something that's insanely complicated, there's still a pulse going on in the background. So you may not understand it yet, but you will in this edition of Music for Dancers. So welcome back to this edition of Music for Dancers. Now, rarely are we going to encounter that kind of complexity out on the dance floor. This is a pretty extreme example. Now remember, we talked about this concept in the last video called the pulse spectrum, where at one end we have the very intense, very obvious pulse, and then on the end that we're talking about here, we're on the implied side of the spectrum, where it's just not obvious unless we're tracking it ourselves. And what the song does is it sets up a pulse and then there's a break. Now during that break, time does not go away. The pulse is still there. Whether you and I can hear it or not is another thing, but with enough experience, you'll start hearing it in all sorts of music that you're listening to. If we're doing tango, it's not an obvious pulse, but once we find it, it will be consistent throughout the song. And there are a couple exceptions there, but overall, 99 out of 100 songs, once you understand where the pulse is, it will stay. So this was an extreme example. The band sets it up, and then at one point the sax player takes his solo, and as long as we track the time, we'll find that it ends perfectly on time. And then the whole band is coming in this case, playing some hits. It's an excellent tune and a great example, and I highly advise you go out and grab it yourself and listen a bunch of times. And you'll see, if you just say, oh, I'll feel it, then good luck. Most people will not get it right, but with enough experience, anybody can. It is something with enough experience that you can get, but this is not a trivial example. So now what we're going to do is we're going to explore some other songs, because the more you hear this concept in context with some easier songs, then the more you'll start hearing it with songs that are a little more intense. So let's start a little simpler and check out a couple different genres, and you'll see that just applies no matter what type of music you're listening to. Very implied pulse in the very beginning. The first couple times I heard it, I wasn't sure. But then I went farther in the song and figured out where the pulse was, and then went back to the beginning, and it was totally consistent. And once you have it, it becomes very obvious to you. So the first thing about it is to be aware that there is a pulse, and it's probably very consistent. Remember that in the introduction, there will be something that's an exception, but more often than not, a song will start at one pulse, and that pulse will stay from beginning to end. And in this case, it started very implied and worked its way to where it's much more explicit. It's not perfectly explicit. There's no percussion there, but for anybody with some experience, that guitar player is playing a very, very clear groove and making it very simple to tell us where the time is. And her singing confirms that, where her phrases start and where they end. You really should go back and watch the videos on phrasing, because this song is a perfect example of 8-bar phrases and the probably 4 concept, the way it lays out from beginning to end. And so now we know where the pulse is. And if you go back to the beginning of this tune, you can count it out and you can find it in approximately 4 bars with enough experience. Well, as you can see, the farther that song went, the more obvious, the more explicit the pulse became. In the beginning, it's pretty mysterious. It's almost cloudy. Maybe you could consider it murky in terms of not being able to pick out the pulses clearly. But the more experience you get with some of these songs, the more the next song comes along, you'll be able to pick it up faster. And one of the golden rules is that the pulse is very consistent. In this case, the way I figured it out, I went further and further into the song, as I mentioned earlier, and figured out the pulse and made sure I was very clear on how it worked, and then went back to the beginning and said, ah, there it is. And there's little markers where you can hear the note change that the musician's playing. It's very subtle, but it is there, and it's yours for the taking. The more you hear it in something like this, the more you'll hear it in the songs you're listening to out on the dance floor. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to use a salsa tune, salsa romantica, something Yo no sé mañana, something that was very popular in the clubs a couple years ago. It's a fascinating tune because it starts with a very implied pulse. There's a piano player and a bass player who are, during the first 8 bars, marking the time, and it's very clear if you have enough experience with this concept of the implied pulse. The first 8 bars, piano and bass, as I mentioned earlier. Then during the second 8 bars, we add in a shaker player who's adding a little more time to give you some hints. And then in the third 8 bars, we've also added a little bit of light conga and bongo. The shaker continues. And then when we hit the fourth 8 bars, then the traditional salsa feel kicks in and the whole band is playing. 7, 8, 1. Little shaker is helping to mark the time for us. Subtle. You need to be on a good sound system to hear this. We're going to add a little more percussion. Third 8 bars now. Timbali players there, conga players a little more obvious. And we're moving away from the implied pulse into the explicit pulse. And it's not 100% explicit, but it's darn close. Much, 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 much clearer than the beginning. Many people will not have picked it up in the beginning, but you'll have a chance. Of course, you have a chance because you're aware. And the first thing that people have to be is aware of how the music works and that there is an underlying pulse, even if they don't hear it instantly. In this song, there's even another layer of complexity added on in that we have both an implied pulse and, in addition, it has what we call a halftime feel. And we're going to have a whole video on halftime feel and double time feel, and that'll come up in the future. But for right now, we have the implied pulse, and during the first 8 bars, it feels halftime. It feels slower. And when I teach this interactively in a classroom and I ask people about the feel change, I'll almost always get somebody that says, well, it also goes faster once this extended introduction is over. And it really doesn't. That pulse, you can march it right from the very beginning to the end of the song and it never changes, but it feels like it goes faster. Of course, one of the huge keys to hearing the different parts is listening with good headphones or listening on a good sound system and hearing these songs over and over again. And when you do, and you take the time and invest the time in hearing it in a couple songs, you'll just be amazed at how you start hearing it in other songs. It does build on itself. So it is worth investing in any one tune. I do have some other songs I want to share with you. I have an excellent tango tune, an excellent bachata tune, and we could handle a tune in almost any genre where this concept comes up. But rather than make this a 2-hour video, I'm going to keep this one a little shorter, and we'll add those next great tunes in the next edition of Music for Dancers. So of course, I always need your help here. Please don't be selfish. Go ahead and share these out with your Facebook friends and your YouTube friends. The more people watching, the better off we all are. Number 2, be sure to subscribe. It's right at the top here. You can subscribe. I think it's right over here, so subscribe. And then make sure you go ahead and add comments. I love your feedback. The more you tell me, the better job I can do for you. I get a chance to do this interactively, both with private students and in classrooms all the time, but doing it on video is slightly different, and I'm learning. I need your help. You give me some feedback. That's also, I love that. So I'm excited about what's coming up in here. We'll explore halftime and double time. We have a whole section coming up on taking the pulse and then finding the one using the pulse, so that we're sure that we're not on the 5. We know where the 1 is, and we know that we know that we know. So there's some great material coming up in the future. I love spending time with you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next edition of Music for Dancers.